Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the IMO podcast, the IMO Diary. Now, we are going to continue with the topic which we were discussing in the last episode. If you haven't checked that out, I recommend that you go see what that was about before watching this or listening to this. We're going to be continuing on the topic of Wetiko, which we had expanded on the previous episode, but just as a how do we say this, a preview of what we had discussed before we move on to today's topic, is we had talked about something called Wetiko. Now, Wetiko, we had said, was a Native American concept that described a phenomenon where a species or a group of people are infected with a psychospiritual disease which is driven by the need to exploit. It's driven by the need to feed itself. It's driven by the need for greed, and it does this at the cost of your fellow human beings. And so I guess one of the best ways to conceptualize that is by thinking about the colonialists who went to native lands and took everything from them without reciprocating. So it's basically about me, how can I benefit, and seeing your fellow human beings as the other and outsiders and something separate from yourself. But one of the things that we said about this Wetiko is that it could lead to a kind of evolution. And we say that Wetiko was something that was happening in mass. It's something that's happening globally. It's something that affects everybody. And anybody who thinks that they're not affected is a fine example of how Wetiko works. So go watch that episode to catch up on what we had said about that. But that story kind of leads to what we're going to be talking about today, which is something that I read a really long time ago in a book that's called Nothing in This Book is True, but It's Exactly How Things Are, by an author named Bob Frisell. And I had read this story. There are so many concepts in the book, so I suggest you go read it for yourself. But there was something in this book that stood out to me, and when I was looking at Wetiko, it kind of reminded me of this thing I read in the book. And so it's almost like this small section in the book is talking about where this disease Wetiko came from. And so we're going to read through it and see if you guys think the same thing as me. So in this book, page 41, there's Bob Fessel talks about something called the Lucifer Rebellion. And so I'm just going to read through it so that you guys can see what piece of the puzzle this is. So the author says, Lucifer was one of the most incredible angels that God ever made. He had a flaw though. However, he thought he was as good as God. Lucifer knew the creationary pattern. He knew the creation pattern, the Markeba. Now, Markeba is something that is covered in this book. If you read the book, you will know, but we can also touch on this on another episode. But just as a rough idea, the Markeba is something, it's a spiritual vehicle, right? It's let's leave it at that. It's a spiritual vehicle. So the author says Lucifer knew the creationary pattern, the Markeba, but it was originally intended to be enacted only internally. Creating it internally meant you had to have your emotional body intact along with your mental body, which protected you. Lucifer went one step further. He dared to do the obvious and create it externally. By separating himself from God, the source, he was in fact not able to do it internally. Yet initially, prior to the consequence, he thought no big deal. He does it internally, I'll do it externally. Same old Markeba. This is like saying the hydrogen bomb is the same as love because it is bright and hot. Externalizing the Markeba was a billion times more serious. Now, this type of experiment against God had been attempted 3 times before, the one that affected our planet, and it always ended in total chaos. The last Lucifer rebellion was about 200,000 years ago, and at the time, he convinced about a third of the angels to join him. Now, about 1,000,000 years ago, the race on Mars was dying from the effects of an earlier Lucifer rebellion, the third one. The planet was terminating from Markeba's running amok. When you create a Makeba internally using love or your emotional body, it becomes a living field around your body. But when you create it externally, you don't have to use love. You only have to use the calculating mind. So it kind of seems like the Merkaba is like it's like a vehicle for traveling. And so some people, I guess, they can create it internally spiritually, so it's your spiritual body that moves around. That's, I guess, what they mean by creating internally. Or you can create it externally where you create spaceships. That's kind of the gist that I get from that. So the author goes on to say, you only have to use. Okay, so here he says, ultimately, this act produces a being with only a left brain who doesn't have an emotional body or understand love. The best example of such a race is the Greys. The Greys are descendants of the Martians and one of the alien races now visiting Earth. Another effect of creating the Merkaba externally is that the act itself is generative of duality. How could it not be, since it dualizes in order to externalize and turn emotions into technology? Once everything is dualized and running on motors, it becomes more and more difficult to perceive the one spirit that moves through everything. So we see good and evil, and even though the one spirit is still present in an externally created world, it is incredibly difficult to discern. When the Martians came to Atlantis, they imported the effects of the Lucifer rebellion right along with them. And this is the deed that led to our downfall on Earth. The problem was that Mars was full left brain culture. The Martians knew and understood everything intellectually, but they had no feeling, especially they had no love. They had no reason to care for anyone other than themselves. As a consequence, they were always fighting and they destroyed the atmosphere just the way we are doing here. As Mars was dying, a small group of Martians, approximately 1,000 or so, built structures in the region we have come to call Cydonia. The massive humanoid face and monuments the Viking spacecraft photographed on Mars in 1976. These monuments represent in exquisite mathematical detail the many levels the form of a star tetrahedron inscribes in a sphere, and they also describe how the Martians created their own unfortunate external Merkaba. They had lost the ability to create an internal Merkaba so long ago they didn't know what it was anymore. After all, such a vehicle requires an emotional body. They, on the other hand, certainly knew how to create an external Merkaba, and they did just that. They got in it and left, believing that was their only option. Through creating this elegant external time-space vehicle, the Martians were able to journey into space, travel in time, and discover and decide the perfect time and place for them to enter. They saw projected far ahead into their future, which was about 65,000 years in our past, this place on Earth called Atlantis, so perfect and waiting for them. That is where they headed. They stepped in against our will and tried to take over immediately, but there were too few of them and they failed. They finally decided to go through the motions of trying out our feminine way, even though they didn't understand or accept it. But they put on a good act. They tried it, in fact, for 50,000 years, but always with disruptions. Their influence on us was strong. We began to switch our consciousness from a female to male orientation. We didn't transmute completely, but we were significantly distorted. When the Martians stepped into our evolutionary pattern in Atlantis, we were about the equivalent of a 13 to 14-year-old girl, and they were the equivalent of a 65-year-old man. They stepped into our evolutionary pattern against our will and essentially raped us. As I said, they would have taken over it if they could, but there weren't enough of them, so they had to go along with our ingenuine program, at least for a while. Even though there were always conflicts, things progressed fairly smoothly until about 16,000 years ago. At this time, a comet hit our planet where Charleston, South Carolina is today. Remnants of the molten stone scattered over an area the size of 4 states, making huge impacts. The Atlanteans were an extremely advanced culture at the time, so they knew the comet was coming. In fact, they had the technology to blow it out of the sky. The Martians advocated using the machinery to destroy the intruder, but even though they had a strong influence on us, our female orientation was still strong enough for us to say no. Basically, the intuitive aspect said, no, don't shoot it out of the sky. It's God, and what will be will be. So let's just let it happen. So the Atlanteans watched the comet hit, and guess what? Most of the damage occurred right in the area where the Martians were staying. In fact, most of the area was totally sunk. For the remaining Martians, that was the last straw. The devotees of the external Merkaba decided from that time on they would not follow our lead anymore and will go their own way. What they did was assemble another Luciferian experiment just like the one carried out 1,000,000 years ago on Mars that resulted in an external vehicle. They still did not have the requisite emotional body and love necessary to create counter-rotating fields as a living entity, for they had done nothing to nurture this aspect of themselves on Earth. They had, or at least they thought they had, the ability to reinvent the Merkaba externally. In so attempting to recreate it, they intensified the pathology of the Luciferian rebellion on Earth, and they also failed miserably. The experiment latched out of control and began to rip open the dimensional levels, causing spirits who were not meant to be here, which is spirits who had been consigned to other dimensional worlds, to come in by the millions. This blew the lid off things. The place just got crazy. Picture thousands upon thousands of yowling, terrified, highly psychic telekinetic entities whipping through not only the atmosphere but the mind, body, and spirit of inhabitants. It wasn't pretty. The second ascended masters helped a great deal by sealing up most of the dimensional tear as quickly as they could, but with millions of these disembodied beings already present, every Atlantean had anywhere from 20 to hundreds of spirits in their bodies. That's crazy. That is really, really, really crazy. Things in Atlantis got much worse than they are here now, though we are fast approaching that. So it's like we started to heal and then we're going back to that. And those spirits are still here. Everyone on this planet has at least a few of them living in their bodies. That is crazy. This really ties in with that story of Wetiko that we had been talking about, right? So this is why I found this fascinating. Anyway, the author goes on to say, this failed experiment happened about 16,000 years ago, and for the next 4,000 years, matters just kept getting worse. The ascended masters, our highest aspects, the very highest degree to which consciousness on this planet has reached, looked outwards from their habitats on the 10th, 11th, or 12th overtone of the 6th dimension and prayed for help. They had to find a way to rescue everyone. They couldn't just get rid of the Martians or kill the disembodied spirits. That is not what ascended masters do. It is not the path of life. So what the ascended masters were looking for and praying for was help in finding a win-win situation for everyone. In the highest aspect of life, there is unity consciousness, and in unity consciousness, there is no duality, no illusion. It is abundantly clear there is one spirit that moves through everything. Then everything is a part of the whole. This is precisely why the ascended masters couldn't just obliterate the Martians. Our modern surgical philosophy of excision, to cut up and take out what isn't working, is not what true life is about. By annihilating the Martians or driving them off, a loss for anyone would ultimately have been a loss for everyone. A lot of intergalactic councils were involved in the ensuing deliberations. They took back into the remote past. I'm sorry. They looked back into the remote past and were able to see something that had been done before and in fact had worked. It required synthetically initiating planetary Christ consciousness, not merely allowing it to proceed naturally, but synthetically beginning the process of creating the Christ consciousness grid on the planet, with the result that everything would eventually be healed. That is crazy. In the last episode, we had said the Native Americans came up with this concept of Wetiko, which is the idea that human beings are suffering from a mass psychosis and we don't know that we are sick. So what Wetiko does is it takes over you and it basically has its own wants and needs, and what it wants is profit. I guess profit is an easy way of conceptualizing that. It wants to advance itself, it wants to feed itself, and so it will do that at the expense of its fellow human beings. And so the Native Americans, this concept, the idea is that every human being on the planet is suffering from Wetiko, and that the only way to be able to guard yourself from it is to acknowledge that yes, you are capable of manifesting this disease. Anyone who says that they don't have Wetiko is part of the problem, right? One of the things about Wetiko is that we see each other as separate and we see each other as us versus them. And we are playing out this game where we are exploiting each other and we are taking advantage of one another and we are destroying ourselves on the planet in the meantime as we are doing this. And so the concept is the guy who wrote about the concept was saying that it's not all bad, because one of the things that this at least allows or facilitates is for us as human beings to acknowledge that this is happening, and perhaps through creating the right approaches and doing the work and working together to figure this out, we can essentially evolve as a human species, right? But what I found fascinating about what Bob Frisell wrote about, or what he talked about in his book, Nothing in This Book is True, but it's exactly how things are, is that in that section about the Lucifer Rebellion, it almost feels like this is where this disease Wetiko came from. Now, I'm a social scientist and we usually do deal with science. This for me is just me indulging some ideas that I've come across in the many pieces of literature that I've read over the years, which I found fascinating. So in psychology, we just say that we are evolving and that our problem today as human beings is that we are suffering from our connection to our primitive minds, which I guess is a lesser mind that we have brought along with us from our evolution as from apes, right? But this story here, because there is information coming out that shows that humanity has been on this planet a lot longer than the story of evolution tries to tell us. So there are so many pieces of information scattered here and there that, when put together, tell a very, very different story from the mainstream stories, which for me I find very fascinating. Whether they are true or not, I really do find them very fascinating. How these stories are consistent, and regardless of where you are on the planet, right? They are consistently spread out throughout the planet. So this Lucifer Rebellion basically says that many years ago there was a war on Mars, and the Martians left Mars and they eventually came to Earth, where they found us human beings who were evolving at our own pace, and they put themselves on our planet and they infected us with whatever psychosis they had on their planet that made them destroy themselves, and that is what is playing out on Earth right now, and that's what's playing out in amongst humanity right now. I found that very fascinating. I think this is a topic that we should continue touching on, and I will share with you guys more ideas as I find them. Check you guys out on the next episode.